In a land far, far away, there lived a beautiful princess named Snow White. She had skin as white as snow, lips as red as roses, and hair as dark as ebony. Her beauty was renowned throughout the kingdom, but her stepmother, the queen, was consumed by jealousy. The queen had a magic mirror, and every day she would ask it, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all?" And for years, the mirror always replied, "You, my queen, are the fairest in the land." But as Snow White grew older, her beauty surpassed even that of the queen. When the mirror declared Snow White as the fairest, the queen's heart filled with envy, and she hatched a wicked plan. One day, the queen summoned her faithful huntsman. She handed him a beautiful, ornate box. "Take Snow White into the deepest part of the forest," she commanded, "and there, in the solitude, put an end to her." The huntsman, who had known Snow White since she was a child, was torn. He couldn't bear to harm the princess. Instead, he led her deep into the forest and said, "Run, Snow White, run as far as you can and never return. The queen wants you dead." Snow White fled deeper into the woods, her heart heavy with sorrow. Birds sang in the trees, and small animals peered out from their hiding places, watching the beautiful princess as she disappeared into the wilderness. Hours turned into days, and Snow White's feet grew tired. She came upon a quaint little cottage nestled among the trees. The cottage seemed abandoned, so Snow White cautiously pushed open the door. Inside, she found a cozy living room with 7 small chairs and a table covered in dishes. What surprised her most were the 7 tiny beds neatly lined up against one wall. Snow White realized that this cottage was home to 7 little occupants. She decided to wait for their return, hoping they would offer her shelter. Meanwhile, back at the castle, the queen eagerly awaited news of Snow White's demise. She approached her magic mirror with a wicked grin and asked, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all?" But to her shock, the mirror replied, "You, my queen, are fair, it is true, but Snow White is fairer than you." The queen's rage knew no bounds. She realized the huntsman had deceived her, and Snow White was still alive. Consumed by jealousy, she began plotting an even more sinister plan. Back in the forest, the owners of the cottage were not what Snow White expected. They were not humans, but 7 dwarfs, each with a unique personality. There was Doc, the wise one who wore glasses and kept everyone organized, grumpy, always complaining, but with a soft heart deep down. Happy, whose name suited him perfectly. Sleepy, who could fall asleep at any moment. Bashful, who blushed easily. Sneezy, constantly plagued by allergies. And Dopey, the youngest and most cheerful of them all. When the dwarfs returned home from their day of work in the mines, they were astonished to find Snow White in their cottage. She explained her plight, and they were moved by her story. They agreed to let her stay with them, and in return, Snow White offered to take care of the cottage and cook for them. Snow White's kindness and beauty quickly won the dwarfs' hearts. They warned her about the wicked queen and her magic mirror. Snow White was safe in their cottage, hidden from the queen's prying eyes. Meanwhile, the queen couldn't rest until she was certain Snow White was no more. She knew that her magic mirror could not be wrong. She decided to take matters into her own hands. Disguised as an old peddler woman, the queen ventured into the forest. She carried with her a beautiful, shiny red apple, but this was no ordinary apple. It was poisoned, and a single bite would bring a deep, eternal slumber. The queen arrived at the dwarf's cottage and knocked on the door. Snow White, always kind to strangers, answered the door cautiously. The queen presented the apple and said, "Dear child, this apple is a special gift. It will grant you a wish when you take a bite." Snow White was hesitant, but tempted by the beautiful apple. She took a bite, and as the poison coursed through her veins, she fell to the ground, lifeless. The queen cackled with satisfaction and hurried away. When the dwarfs returned home that evening, they were heartbroken to find Snow White lying motionless on the floor. They gathered around her, weeping for their dear friend. Hours passed, and they couldn't bear to bury her. Instead, they placed her in a glass coffin and kept a News of Snow White's apparent death spread throughout the kingdom. It reached the ears of a brave young prince who was passing through the forest. When the prince saw Snow White's lifeless form in the glass coffin, he was captivated by her beauty. He knelt beside her and kissed her gently on the lips. As his lips met hers, a miracle occurred. Snow White's eyes fluttered open, and color returned to her cheeks. She had been awakened by true love's kiss. The dwarfs rejoiced, and Snow White thanked the prince for his bravery and kindness. The prince, enchanted by Snow White's beauty and grace, asked her to marry him, and she accepted. The news of their love and Snow White's miraculous awakening spread throughout the kingdom, leaving everyone in awe. Snow White and the prince ruled the kingdom with kindness and fairness, and they lived happily ever after. The dwarfs continued their work in the mines, but often visited the castle, bringing laughter and joy.